Hello and welcome. My name is Hem Kaur Soroya, and today on The Full Context, we track and analyze Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to Iran, which comes right on the heels of US President Joe Biden wrapping up his West Asia tour. Is this a cooperation of convenience between the two nations, Russia and Iran, who remain competitors in the oil market? Also on the agenda is a trilateral between the leaders of Russia, Iran and Turkey. What sort of collaboration can we expect between the three? And what does this mean for Syria? We try and find the answers to all of these questions. Let's begin.
Но так и не будет. В современном мире невозможно вот так все, знаете, циркулем обвести и выставить огромный забор. Это просто невозможно.
Now, there is a saying that nothing in politics happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. Russian President Vladimir Putin's latest tour outside the country is his first since the invasion of Ukraine. His destination, Iran. Putin announced his visit to Iran on the eve of President Biden's West Asia tour, and his announcement was certainly planned this way. Now, you might be wondering, why is Putin headed to Tehran? Well, it is because both countries share a hostile view of the United States. And experts say Putin views this trip as a chance to upstage and outflank Biden. What's on the agenda? Here's what we do know so far. Putin is set to meet both Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Both Russia and Iran have been targeted by US sanctions, and they are expected to cooperate to circumvent and undermine those sanctions. Meanwhile, the United States believes that Russia is seeking hundreds of armed and unarmed surveillance drones from Iran to use in the war against Ukraine. In addition to drones, Iran has an increasingly sophisticated arsenal of long-range missiles it could potentially provide to Russia. Also on the agenda will be the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. President Putin will also meet with Turkish President Erdogan. The two are expected to discuss a UN-backed proposal to resume export of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea. Erdogan's threat to launch another operation in northern Syria, which Moscow opposes. And then in Syria, Russia and Iran have prevailed in their support for President Bashar al-Assad against the West, which called for him to be toppled since the Syrian civil war began in 2011. A trilateral meeting between the leaders of Iran, Russia and Turkey is also scheduled. Now, joining us live for more on this is Fred Ware, Russian affairs expert. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast. Now, it has been observed that this visit is a way for Russia to navigate and undermine the sanctions imposed by the West. What then? Can you tell us about the potential deals on the table and also the international North-South corridor from Russia to India through Iran?
Yes, it is quite remarkable, and an awful lot of diplomacy is converging on Iran right now. In fact, Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia and Israel was mainly about Iran too. And it does seem that that nuclear deal that Donald Trump pulled out of is pretty much dead. Even if it's revived, it would be some completely different thing. And it does also look as though the war in Ukraine has really speeded up, accelerated the tendencies to the world splitting into fragments, no longer a unipolar world, no longer that rules-based international order that they talk about in Washington, but some multipolar new thing that's being born amid all this violence and chaos. And Putin's trip to Iran is about that. It's about specific things. Of course, the North-South corridor is a real big deal. Overland from the Persian Gulf or from the Indian Ocean coast across the Caspian Sea into Russia's very far-flung railroad network not only would give a country like India direct access to the Russian market, to the Central Asian market, to Europe, but it would really change the transport configuration of the world, and also with that economic power and control. So that's one big thing on the table, but more a kind of strategic alliance, the sort of alliance that Iran did develop with China. They have a 25-year cooperation agreement, which is quite sweeping. I think Russia plans to do a similar thing. And it's because, Russian foreign policy experts say, really Russia has given up on the West. Until quite recently, it had the idea that we're going to have some kind of concord with the West, something. Now, Russia's turned its back on that and feels its hands are free to do all kinds of new deals with countries like Iran.
Right. Also, what would you say we can expect from this trip when it comes to ironing out the kinks between the two over higher oil sales in contrast with Iranian counterparts?
Well, the United States has sanctioned some of the world's biggest oil producers. And it's not just about Ukraine. Venezuela is under heavy sanctions and almost forbidden from selling oil for one set of reasons, Iran for another, and Russia now for another. And it does seem like the OPEC Plus agreement is going to hold. Joe Biden did not get from Saudi Arabia much assurance that Saudi Arabia is going to unplug all their wells and start, pouring oil onto the world markets. So the ground is open for new deals among oil producers, all of whom, including Saudi Arabia in its way, are disaffected with the United States. And therefore, I think that you're going to see high oil prices for some time. And then there are going to be favorable customers, India being one of them. India already gets discounted oil from Russia, and Russia and China and Saudi Arabia as well are interested in doing oil deals in their own currencies. That is, to ditch the U.S. dollar and doing that, which is another tectonic shift in the world with unpredictable consequences. But all of this is kind of hanging in the air, as Putin's already in Tehran, so I guess this has begun. But what we may not see like massive changes when he gets back on his plane and comes back to Moscow. But down the road, I think the world's going to be a somewhat different place.
All right. Well, Mr. Fred Ware, thank you so much for joining us with your analysis of this. Now, despite the current relations between Russia and Iran, the two countries have not always been on the same side. They've fought 5 wars with each other, clashed repeatedly since 1651. But in recent times, the two have become increasingly isolated regimes and have found common ground in opposing the United States. Before the war in Ukraine, relations between Russia and Iran were characterized by many as a marriage of convenience. Relations began improving steadily in the first year and a half of Putin's presidency. In October 2007, Putin visited Tehran and met the then Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Their meetings soon followed by the commencement of Russia delivering the 82 tons of enriched uranium to Iran. Tehran needed to start operating the Russian-built nuclear reactor to Bushehr. The delivery of this material was completed at the end of January 2008. Putin's next visit to Tehran would be a decade later. In 2015, when he attended the Gas Exporting Countries Forum Summit, during Hassan Rouhani's tenure, which began in 2013. The ties between Iran and Russia strengthened steadily here. Rouhani visited Russia 4 times during his 8-year tenure. The two regimes became wartime allies in Syria, where they coordinated efforts successfully to prop up the brutal Syrian dictatorship of President Bashar al-Assad, who clings to power despite the death of more than 400,000 Syrians. Russia has sold Iran tanks, warplanes, submarines, other arms in the past, but held off on supplying Tehran with offensive weapons in the recent years due to the UN arms embargo on Iran. That embargo expired in 2020, but Moscow has not announced any major arms sales. Perhaps it's waiting to see whether the lapsed 2015 Iran nuclear agreement can be renegotiated. Now, Syria will be big on the agenda of the talks between Iran, Russia and Turkey. But while Tehran and Moscow are on one side, Turkey is not. Before we dig deeper, a real quick history lesson for you here. The Syrian war began as a peaceful uprising against the president of Syria over 10 years ago. People were unhappy about the high unemployment, corruption, lack of political freedom under President Bashar al-Assad, who succeeded his father after he died in 2000. In March 2011, pro-democracy demonstrations erupted in the southern city of Ware. The Syrian government used deadly force to crush dissent, and more protests demanding the president's resignation erupted nationwide. The unrest spread and the crackdown intensified. Opposition supporters took up arms first to defend themselves, later to rid their areas of security forces. Assad vowed to crush what he called foreign-backed terrorism. The violence rapidly escalated. The country descended into civil war. Hundreds of rebel groups sprung up. It did not take long for the conflict to become more than a battle between Syrians and for or against Assad. Foreign powers began to take sides, sending money, weaponry, fighters. The chaos worsened. Terrorist organizations with their own aims, such as the Islamic State group and the Al-Qaeda, became involved as well. The conflict has left 500,000 people dead, devastated cities, and drawn in other countries. Russia, which had military bases in Syria before the war, launched an air campaign in support of Assad in 2015. This was crucial in turning the tide of the war in the government's favor. Iran, meanwhile, is believed to have deployed hundreds of troops and spent billions of dollars to help. Turkey, on the other hand, it's a major supporter of the opposition, but its focus has been on using rebel factions to contain the Kurdish YPG militia. While Turkey has clashed with Russia and Iran over Syria, Erdogan has joined the Russia-led Astana diplomatic framework that seeks to, in some way, exclude the United States from multilateral negotiations over the future of Syria.
Ne yapamazlar? O ülkeyi alamaz. Bizim de kesinlikle tam bir terör.
Now, correspondent Jody Cohen joins us live for more on this. Jody, thank you for joining us. Now, the meetings between leaders of Iran, Russia and Turkey are reportedly going to focus on Syria. What can you tell us about the specifics or potential areas of discussions on the same?
Absolutely. So later today, we're expecting Presidents Raisi, Putin and Erdogan to be meeting. This will be the 7th meeting of the presidents of these countries. And they're expected to be talking about the Astana process, which seeks agreement between them on Syria. Now, what's interesting is the Syrian president won't actually be there, although Syria's foreign minister is expected to visit Iran later on this week, potentially. Now, all the countries there are going to be promoting their interests in Syria. Now, for Iran, for example, they want to be a key broker in Syria. They're entrenching their forces, and that is seen as a threat to the Israeli and US forces in the region. That's seen as a concern, especially amid Iran's nuclear activities and support for proxies in the region. Now, Russia is focused on the Ukraine war. It could say, some are saying it could suit Russia perhaps to lessen their forces in the region. And if that were to be the case, then Iran potentially could fill that gap. And we've already seen that happen before in northwest Syria, although obviously Russia will want to maintain its forces and presence there as well. Right. Turkey's also thought to be concerned about Iran building up forces in and around Aleppo, but they've got their own security concerns as well, and are talking about a military operation against Kurdish fighters there. They've obviously got their eye on the elections internally in a year. We know that there's unrest in Turkey because of the high number of Syrian refugees there and a growing economic crisis there as well. So President Erdogan says he wants to create a safe zone for the Syrian refugees to be able to return and leave Turkey.
Right, absolutely. Now, Jody, of course, Israel has been very vociferous when it comes to Iran getting nuclear arms. Can you just explain Israel's position on this deal currently?
Right, well, Israel will be certainly watching what is happening today with this meeting in Iran, and particularly with the talks concerning any movement of forces in the region. And that's because Israel doesn't want Iran's forces on its border, and Syria borders Iran. Now, in terms of the nuclear deal, that is also likely to come up in the talks and is an absolutely key issue for Israel. They would support a deal if they believe that it would stop Iran from achieving nuclear weapons. The current deal that is on the table, they do not believe would actually do that. We saw activity last week during President Biden's visit to West Asia. A Jerusalem declaration was signed between Israel and the US, which said that the two countries will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. That was obviously rhetoric. Everyone will be watching to see what further action will take place on that front. We know that Iran has a capability to create a nuclear bomb. There'll be concerns to make sure they don't have the capability of putting a nuclear bomb onto a missile. And Prime Minister Lapid of Israel said that it's important to have a credible military threat in order to stop Iran. President Biden talked about the importance of diplomacy first, but said that actually the US would be prepared to use force as a last resort and would also support Israel in defending itself. And in the latest, the chief of the Israel Defense Forces, Aviv Kohavi, said that diplomacy can fail and that he believes Israel has a moral obligation to be ready with a military response against Iranian nuclear facilities if necessary.
Right, absolutely, Juri. Now, of course, we are in for some tectonic shifts in the region as well. Now, what does this mean for Israel, and what extent of cooperation can we see between Russia and Iran?
So I think all eyes will be on this meeting. There's a lot happening, a lot of shifts happening in geopolitics in the region. You've got Israel and Russia coordinating. On the one hand, Russia allowing Israel reportedly to enter Syrian airspace where it has control in order to keep back the Iranian forces in the region. Then you've got Russia and Iran meeting. This is President Putin's first visit abroad since the Ukraine war. And the Ukraine war will definitely come up in the talks too. It's thought that Russia is seeking to buy drones from Iran. And the American press are reporting that Russian officials actually viewed these drones in Iran on Friday and last month. Iran also will be keen to sell drones to raise funds for its regional activities as well. So a lot of things set to be discussed. A lot of eyes will be on this meeting later on today and also on the bilateral meetings that are expected to take place.
Right. Well, Jody, thank you so much for bringing us all the updates on this.
Thank you.